All right, welcome everyone to our first session of the construction and um, evaluation exam. Thanks for joining today's ARE CSE Study Hub. Um, Whether you're preparing for the ARE divisions or the California supplemental exam, we're here to help you succeed. Let's dive into today's topics and feel free to ask questions in the chat as we go along. A few quick housekeeping reminders before we get started. Please only unmute when called upon by a moderator. You may also leave questions in the chat box. Please keep questions relevant to the topic at hand and do not ask questions or share information that would violate NCARB's ARE candidate agreement. Finally, AIA California strongly encourages attendees to be constructive in their comments and questions to the presenters and to one another to ensure we have a session that's productive and environment that's a positive learning experience for everyone. Let's take a moment to celebrate the success of our fellow hub members. If you've recently passed a section, please let us know in the chat. Every exam is a milestone worth celebrating. Well, let's get started then. I'm Michael Cintron. I'll be moderating this session. I'd like to now introduce our host, David Molinaro, AIA. David is a licensed California architect with experience in medical architecture, OSHPD 1 and OSHPD 3, including medical space design up to 55,000 square feet and $60 million budgets. With more than 25 years of experience in design problem solving and 15 plus years in project management, he facilitates teamwork and personal excellence by nurturing an organizational culture focused on the triple bottom line. David both taught architecture at Orange Coast College and served on the AIA Orange County Board, including organizing the ARE prep programs for them. So welcome, David, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. And thank you for the nice introduction. The screen is mine, right, Ashley? We're good to go?
Yep, it's all yours.
Okay, so let me do a little screen organization first, folks. Get myself sharing. Okay, so I think everybody is now should see a slide that says ARE 5.0 construction and evaluation, right? We're good?
You're all good.
Sounds good. So first, thank you everybody for joining. I support this program. I think it's great that you all are in the throes of testing. It hasn't been so long since that's been me. So let me first you heard a general kind of introduction to who I am. And I'm project manager, licensed architect. I currently work at a firm in Southern California. Feel free, if it's appropriate, Ashley, to reach out via email to me. And I think I'd like to start with kind of just telling you a little bit about my own testing experiences, right? So I'm a person who went to architecture more mid-career. I went back to school and I tested under ARE 4.0, the previous version. And I started, testing a little over and studying a little over 10 years ago. At that time, there are 7 exams. And what worked for me is taking all of the exams pretty quickly. At that time, we also had something called a 6-month clock. So I found a study regimen that worked for me. And so, this is basically what the classes that I found, and it was kind of fast paced. It was a test every couple weeks, like every 2 to 3 weeks. And, with that, I had to get through all the tests. None of us are saints in this. So, I did pretty well until I got to building systems, and I made a really silly error in that one on at that time, vignette, and misread some lighting systems. Took the rest of the tests, but then I had to kind of wait out for a 6-month rolling clock at that time and take the same one again and fail it again for a different silly reason, and then wait again and then test again for that one. So I became licensed in 2015, right? So I have been licensed for uh, 10 years and almost 3 months, right? Um, Now I'd like to just kind of talk a little bit about study strategy and testing strategy, because I think there might be some new folks. So this is straight out of the, kind of the NCARB materials, right? And this is something that I think is really, really, really important. This is a timed test. And if you do the math, you got a little over 2 minutes per question, right? So our goal is not to answer every question perfectly, right? Our goal is to answer every enough questions to get to the minimum passing threshold, right? So I kind of used a strategy of sorting questions into 3 buckets. And the 3 buckets that I used were: I know this question, I know the answer, I'm very confident. This is my final answer, mark it and move on. The second bucket of questions was, well, I think I can make a good guess at this. I can use strategies. I can eliminate a question or two. I can, kind of look at a couple different strategies and maybe improve my odds. So I'm going to answer this, but mark it and move on. And then the third bucket was basically, I'm a native English speaker. I see some words in this question. I have no idea what they mean. I'm not going to answer it right now. I'm going to mark it and move on, right? And try and get through every single question and then go back and see if I can increase my odds on that second tier, the ones I'm pretty sure about the answers, and then take a guess at the third one. So the test we're talking about today is construction and evaluation. I think probably you all might have seen, from the NCARB materials, that this one is broken down into 12 different kind of learning objectives. There's 12 different areas that we need to be fluent in. So we're going to talk today kind of about the first section. We have limited time, so we got to kind of go through some of the stuff fairly quickly. But first, I kind of want to talk to everybody about the strategies I use for myself to kind of maximize my success. And so I did this with my AREs. I am also a certified accessibility specialist. I did the same thing with that test, which for me was harder than the AREs. And some of this, I'm going to admit, I was doing it, but I kind of stole the format from another guy at the time, a few years ago, one of my coworkers, who was then testing for the AREs also. So here's kind of what it went, right? Or how it worked, right? I found it really important to get a calendar, right? And to plot out on a calendar what my study plan was, and to have it there in front of me, so I could mark my progress and cross off the days that I studied. I wanted to study every day, except for Saturdays and Sundays. So how I did it was kind of, between 1 to 3 hours a day. And again, remember, I did it very quickly. 1 to 3 hours a day, with Saturday being a mega study session, and then Sunday reserved for kind of family time, right? And that was important. And again, not my idea. I sought out some counsel from a friend of mine, kind of a mentor, who told me this study habit from his MBA days. Okay. So that's the log. You got to kind of get into, I recommend printing it out and having it somewhere visual that you can see it every day that you're going to study. And then the second part of it is to ritualize, right, or make it a habit how you're going to study. For me, what that meant when I was doing like the CASP exam is I'd get to work an hour early, go into a room, close the door, right? And it was 1 hour in the morning, set up my structure, right? I always had the same cup of coffee, always had everything in the same position on my desk, always closed the door, so I was uninterrupted, always turned off the cell phone and limited the interruptions, and just did it for 1 hour, right? And so it became a ritual every single day for studying. And then the weekend days were a lot more. So the more that you can make it a habit, the better that will go. On studying, I found it worthwhile to take several passes through the material. And for me, it worked that I would be taking notes into kind of a separate notebook or a separate log and go through that once. Once I'm through the materials, then I'd kind of set it aside and just use my notes from then on. This test has got some stuff in contracts about it, so I wanted to talk a little bit about contracts also. What was recommended to me on reading the contracts and studying the contracts was, first, read the 201 contract, take notes. Then it was read the 201 contract again. And then it was read the 201 contract again, right? So 3 passes through it to kind of get it cemented. It's dry, but that's just kind of how it is. The things to take note of are things in the contracts, which are responsibilities and numbers, like how many days it takes to do, to respond to this, or how many days you have. And it's usually, like just going off my memory, like 7, 10, or 14, right? There's certain numbers that you can categorize. So, all right. So let's jump into taking a look at the first part of construction and evaluation. So the 3 objectives at the kind of the front end of this test are pre-construction activities and what do we do during that time, and how is that affected by the project delivery method. Then there are also some other objective 1.2 and 1.3 about helping the owner to select a contractor, and then analyzing parts kind of the pre-design. I think I got a duplicate slide here. Sorry about that. So sorry, no, this is the other parts of the test. So we're not going to have time today to go over the second set of objectives. Those may be covered in a later session. The third set of objectives about procedural stuff. And then the final part about closeout. I found that this stuff was important. It's important to me. I still do these tasks in my role now. I've been working at closing out a couple of projects over the past few months. Attended a bid conference in the the past month or so, kicking off construction. So, and read more contracts than I care to talk about. So let's just jump into this kind of first one with construction evaluation, the pre-con activities. And so how I went about studying these for myself, and when we studied with the AIA Orange County, was really dissecting the objectives into a couple key things, right? So for 1.1, the key things are bidding documents, kind of procedures, the pre-bid meeting, what are the, how do we help the bidders, and what are the AIA documents? Finally, the project delivery type. So we will go over today some of the information about project delivery types. The second objective is about contractor bids, right? Accuracy and completeness. And then helping the owners to look at these bids and compare. While the final objective, has to do with the project cost and how we look at those elements. So let's get into the architect's role, right? A lot of my contracts that I work on are kind of sometimes they're smaller and they're just a standard design bid build. And for testing, we need to know a handful of project delivery types and what the contracts mean in terms of contractual relationships. So design, bid, build. I, the architect, am contracted to the owner. I do not have any contractual obligation to the contractor, but the owner and the contractor have their own contract. I serve as a check and balance for the owner. In that relationship, these are some of the questions that we will answer with that contract. What is to be designed and built? Where's it going to be? What is the level of quality that the owner is looking for? What's the role of the project? Is it a lab, a home, an office? What is the program? And what are the schedule or time constraints? Do we have some outside schedule constraints that might be budget related, contract related that we need to be aware of? What's the target completion date? The owner is responsible for giving us a budget, construction budget that we can design to. And then if known at the beginning, who are the other team members? So in my work with Taylor Design, a part of what I did is to set up the teams, the consultants that are appropriate to the project. So knowing what the type of project is and what might be needed has been crucial. At the beginning, we've got to identify the owner and architectural tasks, both administrative, operational, design and construction, to meet the requirements. We got to identify who needs what, and also assist the owner in pulling together a list of the general contractors to bid on this if asked. It's remember, it's the owner's responsibility to identify the contractors and to qualify them, but we may be asked for our opinions. And we might have time to cover this a little bit later in the bidding part of things. We're merely advising the owner in this regard. The timeline, can be a rough outline schedule, or it can be pretty in-depth, and should identify the tasks in the project. The key here for us is to identify tasks or dependencies that might delay the project and affect the owner's timeline. And some unknowns, like, if there's a line item that's obtain financing, we might need to kind of work on that calendar part of it a little bit, or, get planning approval. When we've agreed on the schedule, the tasks, and the responsibility, then we go through the process of compensation and fees and developing those. And now we're kind of ready to start working on the contract. The contract should handle the description of the services to be provided, the fees for those services, the name and the address and the licenses of the architect and perhaps other team members, how additional services or non-contracted services are to be handled, and also how the parties can terminate this. So take a breath. A lot of information already. We're going kind of fast through this, but it's just okay. There's a lot of information, and I know you guys have an independent study track. So in the contract between the owner and the contractor, we do have some responsibilities, and those are kind of outlined in that contract. So do take a look through the contractor B101 as well. So let's talk about project delivery methods. We as architects, after hearing what the owner wants to do, we work with them. We can recommend a project delivery method. We have to look at the schedule, kind of the budget, what the important drivers are for the decision making, and then the owner, based on our options, should review the project delivery method, and then it's their responsibility to kind of implement the project delivery. It is helpful to have input or consultation with a contractor. So here's a kind of a handful of the basics, right? Design, bid, build, construction manager at risk, integrated project delivery, and then fast track might show up. It's important to kind of know about what that is. And some of the, relative advantages of each type of project delivery. So if cost is the prime driver, you can see in this chart that design, bid, build is probably the way to go, right? If, scope or schedule, right, is the way to go, you might end up with traditional or construction management. So let's kind of go through a couple of these as we go. So for everybody, take a read through these slides, right? These are two of the most common. I've kind of worked on versions of both of these. The most common and probably the most tested is going to be the design, bid, build, or the traditional, where there are just three entities, owner, architect, and contractor, and then separate contracts. In this, there is a bid phase with competitive bidding, and it's very linear in sequencing. and the contractor's selected based on the lowest bid. In the design build, the owner may opt to simplify by creating, one entity, one person, or one team to answer to. And in that case, there can be like an architect-led design build or a contractor-led design build. And that one entity does both the design and the construction. In this, there can be overlapping phases. Some others that you should take a look at is construction management at risk. Construction manager, kind of an outside third party, is kind of taking hold of the construction manager role and has a fixed fee, or what's called a GMP, guaranteed maximum price in that case. We are not in contract with them. And then the final one is an integrated project delivery type of thing where everybody is in one entity, everybody shares in the risk and the reward, and it's best for complex projects. So now we're going to get to a little bit more of an interactive part. And so if you all have something to write with or some way of kind of doing this, what I'd like is to see if you can assign architect, contractor, construction manager, or owner, one of each of these letters to one of the three circles, and then a line between the circles that indicates who the contract is between. And we'll go through this first one just as an example, right? But then I've got a couple more slides for you to take a look at and see kind of how we do. So in design bid build, the most traditional way of contracting projects is going to have the owner with a contract between the architect and then an owner with a separate contract to the contractor. There is between the architect, let's see if I can do that. Between kind of the architect and the contractor, there might be kind of a dashed line or an implied relationship of the checks and balances, right? Checks and balances. So this is kind of a useful diagram for those of us that are more visual. Okay, for everybody. Now it's your turn. If we have a construction manager at risk, take a crack at putting one of those entities into each one of these circles. So we'll give about 60 seconds or so for you to take a look and see if you can draw the straight lines between the circles to indicate, the contractual relationship. Nice. I see somebody marking up the screen already. And straight lines for contractual relationship. So this is construction management with a construction manager as an advisor. Important distinction between advisor and at risk in how the contracts go. So we're about 1 minute in. Let's take a look at the contractual. So for construction manager advisor, there's a contractual relationship between the owner and the architect, the advisor to the owner, and then the contractor. No contractual relationships between these three entities. Okay. Next one, if you guys can erase your markups, or we can start. We're going to go to construction manager as agent. Construction manager as agent. So whoever has got the red writing, let's do this. Thank you. Same basic exercise. We've got a construction manager as an agent. They're providing early consulting. They might act on behalf of the owner in assembling, and coordinating the construction trades prior to and during construction. They typically provide their services with a fixed fee, assume no risk for the actual construction cost, but pass on both the savings and the overruns directly to the owner, right? So construction manager as agent. Anybody want to try that one? Okay, I see Anna. Yep, that's exactly what it is as an agent, right? They're acting on behalf of the owner, right? And they might assemble the team, the architect and the contractor. So let's move on to the next one. If you can erase your marks. This is going to be construction manager at risk. Construction manager at risk. The constructability in this one, the constructability and the cost. Hold on, let me reset. The cost advisor's role of the contractor during the project's design and transition, at some time during the predetermined time, to the more traditional, perhaps design bid build. This method frequently includes a guaranteed maximum price, which is going to be a commitment by the construction manager to hit a certain dollar figure. So in this, an inherent thing is that the construction manager has kind of a dual role of an estimator and a contractor. So they kind of have both hats to wear. And so let's take a look at the contractual relationship, construction manager at risk. So in this case, the construction manager has the contract with the owner, and they may be hiring the contractor to do the work because they have a maximum price that they are guaranteeing to this owner. So contract, and again, an implied relationship between the architect. Now, the next one, design build, is a little bit different. This delivery method gives the owner kind of a single point responsibility for both design and construction. So what do you suppose a diagram might look like for design build? And remember, we can have either an architect-led entity or a contractor-led entity. Yeah. I see a diagram, which pretty good. Pretty good so far. So thank you, Anna. I think you've already been studying this exam. Let's see, kind of one of the final ones. I think we got one or two more questions before we get into the second objective. So bridging design build. In this one, it's a variation on the design build, in which the project team include both a design architect who establishes the design and then a production architect who determines the technical criteria and generates the CDs. So it's a little bit different animal. And we need one more contract line. There you go. Sounds good. Exactly. So we got a contract between the owner and the design architect, and then a contract between the production architect contractor group. Okay, and then the last one, integrated project delivery. So in this one, the kind of larger projects can be run with integrated project delivery. Usually there's a formal and binding kind of multi-party contract structure that includes, at a minimum, the architect, the owner, and a builder. And in this, shared risk, shared reward. This guarantees kind of early participation by all the stakeholders, early on in the project. So in my work, I've done some kind of hybrids with this. Hybrids in the sense that the contractors are brought in early in the design for design assist, and they have a certain contractual responsibility early on in the design. The benefits of this are collaboration among the owner, architect, and contractor, and then, kind of indemnification. So in this case, everybody's kind of part of the same entity by contract. So a little bit more traditional question for you all. When does this project delivery method start? Like, when do we start talking about this? Beginning of the project? CDs? Bid documents? Bid conference? When do you think we do this? So this is going to be definitely at the beginning of the project, because the owner's scope and schedule and budget, all those three things kind of figure into the type of project or the project delivery that the owner would want. If you all want kind of more another resource about this, there is I found useful kind of an AIA relationships diagram. This is just a free PDF that kind of shows the contracts and shows what contracts are available. This is the diagram, right? Or the document, easy to search it, and it kind of goes over all the different types of contracts that we might run into. So pretty good resource. And again, it's called just the contract relationship diagrams. Let's see. Um, one of the other things that I developed for the AIA is just basically a list of kind of questions that you might use um, on contracts. Let's see. I think I have it still open. Yeah. So I have kind of a document, and I think our facilitator is going to put this in the chat for everybody as a document that you can download, right? And it's just a series of questions about contracts. So you can use it to kind of help when you're going through contracts to study. And I think that can go into the chat now, right? Is that correct?
Yep, dropping it in right now.
Okay. The other part of that is the answer key, right? So sometimes there have been some discussions about that, but take a look at that. Contracts are dry, but they're necessary, especially in this test. If you find errors, please let me know. And Ashley, I think we were reserving towards the end about what, 15 minutes or so for the question and answer. Is that right? Or less?
I'd say about 10 minutes.
About 10 minutes. Okay. I want to make sure we keep us on schedule then. So, okay. We'll kind of skip over this for contracts, right? Your firms might do different things. For exams, it's AIA, it's AIA, it's AIA. So always use AIA contracts. They're free, they're online, download them. Control F is your friend in studying. Find the keywords. So a word kind of about fast track, because that might come up. It's not an actual project delivery methodology. It's just a way of kind of speeding up construction by starting part of the project while the remaining parts are still being designed or drawn up, right? So fast track can happen in different project delivery types. The key to know about fast track is that the biggest and highest cost decisions are made first, right? And the smallest and low cost decisions are made last. So we track the risks from biggest risks down to smallest risks, right? All right. We'll go over just quickly the objectives 1.2 and 1.3, right? So in this objective, right, you've got to help the owners evaluate contractors' bids, right? And compare them for both accuracy and completeness, right? You might be asked also to compare qualifications for each of the contractors. So our part is helping the owner get bids, responding to bid RFIs. And again, I responded last week to a bid RFI, right? So this stuff is worthwhile and tasks you're going to be doing as a licensed architect. You might have to issue addendums and review the bids. The owner's, responsibilities are, hey, looking at those bids and selecting the contractor based on the parameters kind of established. And then the contractor responsibility, again, on the design bid build, just signing the contract with the owner. The basic steps in this process are assisting the owner with a bid package and the bid documents. Those are going to be construction documents, specifications. There might be other documents included during the bid. The bid period, You have responsibility to respond to the RFIs and the questions and issue the addenda. I attended a bid walk, relatively recently, and the bid conference, as a representative for the company to talk about what's in the documents or just be a resource. When the bids are submitted, you may be asked to review, you might not. In my last kind of thing with the bids, it was public, right? UC California Irvine, and didn't need to look at the bids, but I did attend kind of the selection or the opening of the bids. Public bid openings are open in the public eye. Most of the private owners just open them in private. And for any of the more fine details on this, you can take a look at the B101 contract. For public projects, criteria is usually established as lowest bidder, lowest qualified bidder, right? There can be some criteria for that. And then for some other types of items for that, you may be asked to have some different alternatives if there are money differences involved with some of the design options. And let's just look quickly at the third of the objectives in this first category. Analyze the aspects of the contract design and adjust project costs, right? So we're responsible for looking at the project cost, scope, quality, and or schedule, and possibly evaluating. We may need to understand the differences and communicate the differences clearly to our owners, because we are the experts in construction. They are not. There may be some information that we need to supplement, right, with the bidding. And then more importantly, kind of analyzing the bidders or kind of the bids themselves, including cost, right? People have got a lot of different methodology for selecting the bidders, and it will depend on the project type. And with that, I still have quite a few more slides and I could keep going, but I do want to leave kind of ample time for question and answers if there are any. So I think we're gonna kind of take a rain check and hopefully be able to get into this a little bit later. Please, I shared my contact information at the beginning. If I can be a resource for you, please do reach out as you're studying. And I think we'll get into kind of the last of the sample questions, right? So let's use this to wind up, right? In developing a list of bidders, what's our role?
I've also made it so everyone can unmute in case you want to vocally answer.
Gotcha. So in, private project, our role is going to be to recommend the qualified contractors. This is in developing the list of bidders. The ranking the contractors would be after we've received the bids if the owner wants our help. Got one more quick one. We'll skip that and leave some time for the questions. So let's get in and see if there are any questions that I can answer for folks. And they can be questions about my own experiences studying, the testing, or content, or even day-to-day stuff.
David, it looks like we have one in the chat.
Ah,
Says, is there any liability when recommending contractors?
great question. I honestly don't know what the contracts say. In my experience, there hasn't been liability because they're usually uh, kind of superficial or kind of overall recommendations to owners. It's still on the owner to do their due diligence because the contract is between the owner and the contractor and, traditional design bid build. In the other project delivery methods, there could be liability if we're in a design build where we're actually contracted, with an entity. So yeah, I think there could be in that case. Let's see.
I had a question about how much the insurance and the bonds, how much of that information would be reviewed by architects when they're, selecting contractor, or is that mostly handled by the owner?
Typically in our contracts, the insurance requirements are visible to us as the architect. The insurance requirements from the owner are visible to us as the architect. We don't have visibility for the contractor, right? Because of the contractual relationship. If the owner chooses to share that, but it's not a requirement, what's required of us as architects is to meet the insurance requirements of the owner for our own insurance. And then when we have consultants to verify that the consultant's insurance meets the requirements of the owner. We didn't quite get into the C401 contract. That's our contract between us as architects and our consultants. But I can honestly say I wish I read through it in testing. I've looked at a lot of C401s in putting together teams, right? And the insurance is always one of the things that comes up. So does that answer your question, Brandon?
Yeah, I think so.
Cool. Sure. Well, let's take a look. I'm going to stop sharing now, Ashley, if that's okay, and see everybody. Let's see, get to everybody here.
It looks like one more question just popped in.
Great.
How do you cover the technical detail portions regarding construction details for CE or for the CE exams? Because besides the contract, there are technical details questions that I'm not sure what to study for.
So I don't quite remember the overlap from my own testing, but I would want to be familiar with construction details for construction and evaluation. So I think later in the objectives, there's some more information about the details. And I might expect to have to, I'm just kind of thinking through a test question might be something about an RFI and a technical detail, right? So I would spend some time looking at technical details. My testing during the 4.0, this was all kind of lumped together into one with construction and documents and services all kind of lumped together. So it was a part of my testing, and although years ago I looked at kind of the exact crossover, I don't remember how that's included in this exam. So where can we find the relationship diagrams? That is an AIA. I did a search for on the AIA website, and I'll just put it into, someone's got it there in the chat already. Yeah. Other questions? I can start calling on people. I know how to do this. I would say if you have a question, ask it, because chances are somebody else has also got the same question. So the question was, so can we use the AI forms for contracts even though we are not licensed? Is that the question, correct? I think you probably can, like but I don't know for sure. You know, the AI contracts are purchased, right? What we see in the exam are just the PDF samples. But I gotta say, I don't know if we can or if we don't, but it seems like someone has answered that as yes. I think I would reason it out just this way. So I've remember hearing that, from my ex-boss, that most architecture firms, the people in positions of leadership are licensed and, kind of AIA members, with very few exceptions, but there are people in leadership roles in firms that are both unlicensed and possibly not. So I would say that's probably a good answer. Yes, you can use them. Time for a couple more questions. And I think for you folks that are studying for this, I want to also just let you know, our profession needs more licensed architects, right? Until I think it was about 5 years ago or so, the number of licensed architects, people getting licensed every year, was declining year over year over year. And it just kind of turned the corner, about 5 years ago, where more people were getting licensed than the previous year. So we do need more licensed architects, and there are a lot of opportunities for you upon licensure. One thing I want to give you, which was based on the AIA salary calculator. I did an analysis about 5 years ago, using the data from the AIA and our own region, which is the Pacific region on the calculator. And so the difference between an unlicensed individual and a licensed architect at that time, about 5 years ago, was about worth $10,000 more in salary per year. So upon licensure, you should expect a salary boost. And I did the math back then over a 30-year career. What does that mean? That means the extra 10,000 over about 30 years is worth a lot of money. It's worth a house. So if financial is your motivation, there's definitely a need. And I see that we're about out of time, Ashley.
We are. I do see one last question. Is there some flashcards that they can study or practice questions that you think are good to use?
Yeah, I think part of my instructions were, to kind of keep the study materials neutral. I used a variety of study materials from ones that I paid for, to ones that were free or recommended. I did purchase flashcards for my own testing and use those. I used those while my wife and I were walking our dogs at the time, and she would read them as we were walking the dogs, and she would drill me on the flashcards. Some other folks that I know from the AIA Orange County, they used an app on their phones to make their own flashcards. So find something that works for you and then repeat it.
Well, I'd say that's perfect. And with that, we are wrapping up tonight's session. So our next session is on June 16th with Bryn Young. It is our next CE session and our last for a while. We're hopefully going to fit one more in to make up for the one that was skipped. And I just want to say thank you so much, David, for making the time to join the session.
Sure.
I think everyone
You're
can
welcome.
agree that this was very informational.
You're
So
welcome.
everyone go enjoy the rest of your evenings. Hopefully have some dinner if you haven't had any yet. And I hope you all have a great night.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Good luck with your studying and testing. And we'll see some of you in the global digital social media sphere where we live. Thanks, everybody.